Hey, Alan, I just picked up some new cards from my cube. I was wondering if you wanted to fire a couple one-on-one drafts just to get some playtesting in, a little practice.
What are we talking about? Practice?
Yeah, I just think that, some quick one-on-one games are a great way to get a handle on new cards.
I know that.
Okay.
And I'm not shoving it aside,
Yeah.
like it don't mean anything.
Okay, sure.
I know it's important. I do. I honestly do.
Okay, well then let's just play right now.
We're not even talking about the game, the actual game, when it matters. We're talking about practice.
I mean, it's still a game. It's just that it's
listen, we're talking about practice.
Yeah.
Not a game.
It is a
game. We're talking about practice.
Come on, Alan. Stop.
Not a game. Not the game that I go out there and die for.
A little dramatic.
And play every game like it's my last. Not the game. We're talking about practice, man. I mean, how silly is that, man? We're talking about practice.
So you just don't need to playtest anything at all. You know it all already.
You see me play, don't you?
Yeah.
You see me give everything I got, right?
Yes.
But we talking about practice right now. We talking about practice.
You know what? Forget it, Alan. I'll just go draft against myself.
We're talking about practice, man.
Oh, so everyone thinks it's funny? I'm going to draft
We're
alone?
talking about practice. We're talking about practice. We ain't talking about the game. We're talking about practice, man.
I'm glad everyone thinks it's so funny that I'm going to go draft against myself alone.
It's funny to me, too.
You ready? To go right now?
Yeah.
You're just ready to go?
Oh, no.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, then hello and welcome to a brand new, shining episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony 3060 Maddox.
Ooh, on the stream I did, but then we played Cube, our usually weekly Cube draft, and did not great.
Why would you bring up the time of you doing bad after I'm trying to bring up the time of you absolutely
just keep it
mopping
level.
the floor
just
with me?
Keeping it level,
Just
keeping it even.
Clean sweep. We are trying to stream again every Monday, and last Monday, Anthony just absolutely just annihilated me. 3060, not close in really any game at all whatsoever. And in the second set of drafts, I really thought I had a good deck. I thought my deck was better than yours.
I didn't feel well positioned at all in that matchup.
So we're both just bad at playing Magic and bad at evaluating things because I thought mine was favored, and then I just... No chance.
I mean, it's really not fair because we were playing my cube, and as we all know, all cube designers are masters of their own environment, and they just, can't possibly lose, and they're really unfairly advantaged, right?
Yep, absolutely. It's been my experience for sure, 100%. So if you want to see us play some cube and maybe bring in some friends from our local playgroup, you can tune in to our stream on twitch.tv/LuckyPaperMTG. If you're listening to this episode the day it comes out, we will be streaming tonight with our friend Allison. So...
Ooh,
tune in for that.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And if there's other stuff you want to see us do, maybe we can do some cube design chats or building or, feedback updates. We can do whatever we want there.
I do want to do that. It's hard to, I do want to do some
a
design.
little bit of structure.
That or just commit to not having a structure and just hang out. And
so
see what
either come with a structure or don't.
Yeah,
and
two
just
options.
Do it.
The two complete options. On this week's episode, we are going to be answering, I think, a pretty universal question to all cube designers, which is just how do you test your cube? It seems like an obvious question that I don't think we've ever directly addressed on the show, despite the fact that we're 120 some episodes in. And I was inspired by this topic because someone on the Discord, user Boy Sage, just asked, how do you all test your cubes? And I was like, what a great question. How do you know if the cards you're putting in and the design choices you're making are successful or not, especially when not everybody gets to draft with a full pod all the time? I mean, we are lucky that we draft every single week and some weekends do some cube drafts, but we also have a ton of cubes in our playgroup, so any individual cube is not getting played more than, I don't know, once or twice every couple months. Like, we're not playing the same cube over and over again. So even though we play all the time, we still don't have that sort of constant flow of feedback about a specific environment.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a basic question that I think all cube designers should ask. So it's kind of, it's amazing how it's easy for us to take things for granted and sort of look past some of the obvious, really important, fundamental topics. So I'm glad we're going to talk about this.
I think the first thing we have to answer, Anthony, is what do we mean by testing?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. I mean, I think that I want to sort of take a little bit of a step back and just think about play testing in terms of,
you want to take a step back further from what are we even testing?
So back. It's like we see the forest, it's just a little cluster of trees in the distance.
Games?
What is games? I mean, play testing is a really fundamental part to game design, as well as just any creative project. We can swap in play testing for just, testing, actually experiencing the thing. I think it's very easy for a designer to get caught up in the details and sort of the theoretical implications of what are they making and is it going to work out. But, you don't necessarily always know if something's going to work out if you don't give it a try. So I think especially with game design, it's easy to think about all the like mechanics of a resource system and the individual game pieces and how they fit together and sort of have an image of how that's going to work, but it doesn't always necessarily pan out the way you expect when players are, not necessarily looking just to do the thing that you think is fun that you want them to do, but when your players sit down and try and optimize it and win, it could just turn out, well, your resource system doesn't really work because there's only one optimal way that is pretty clear, and once you sort of find that optimal path, players just do that same thing and ignore all the other fun stuff you're trying to do. And when we're taking that sort of to cube design, the same thing happens. You might have this idea about, well, I've designed these particular archetypes or these themes or this kind of interaction that I think is going to support a certain kind of gameplay, but you don't really know if that's going to pan out until you get players actually trying to sort of break the system and kick the tires on it and try and win and see if they actually end up doing the fun stuff that you put there while trying to optimize it and win.
And I would say even if they're not trying to win, whatever the player does is valid, right? Like the way that
totally.
someone like Daniel...
That's a great thing to point out.
The way that someone like Daniel drafts my cube, I would not say Daniel's main aim is winning when he sits down to draft my cube, but I care that Daniel still sees cards in the pack that he's excited about, right? Like,
sure.
I know which cards the really spiky players are going to be excited about because I have a decent sense of the most powerful cards in my cube, but I also need to know what kind of cards Daniel wants to see to like get him invested in a draft and excited to play. Because ultimately, I mean, I think we need to establish a baseline that I think almost everybody listening to this show, I know Anthony and I can say this for sure, we want our cube to be fun. That is what we're testing for,
That is
right?
the goal, yeah.
Like you want the cube to be a fun thing to draft with your friends. You want to have a good time with people you enjoy being around. And I think sometimes that detail can get lost in the hyper focus on the like balance in a time-traveling supercomputer sense.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of sort of sub-goals that we set up for ourselves, like, hey, we want this cube to be fun, and one way that it's going to be fun is if every color or color pair is reasonably equally viable, that means that we can get a lot of different drafts and see a lot of diverse decks, and have players not feel like they, got stuck in the open lane, but just of a bad color pair. So, like, that kind of sub-goal of seeking balance of colors is still valid, but it's only in service of this ultimate goal of we want this to be fun. And I mean, what fun means for your particular group of players is going to vary wildly, but just keeping in mind whatever kind of fun that is that your play group is looking for is really key.
Yeah, I mean, I think what flows from wanting the thing to be fun, wanting the experience to be fun for everybody, is some semblance of game balance, right? Mm-hmm. You do want that because I think while it's true that lots of playgroups will have different values and different preferences, Magic players do have some kind of little bit of shared DNA. We enjoy playing games, and the reason
we're all blue players.
Sure, and there's something about playing games that that brings us all together, right? That's like the uniting force, and that's really the thing that's so valuable, I think, about Magic as a like social tool is that you can expect people sitting down to play Magic are going to have at least these like tiny threads binding them in terms of what they enjoy and what they're interested in and what they think about, and designing a cube, I think, is a great exercise in trying to find that common ground and make a thing that a diverse group of people can enjoy based on the things they share. And I do think that some semblance of balance, and again, what balance even is could be a whole episode, that is, I think, part of that for sure.
Right. So at its core, playtesting just means actually playing the cube, playing the environment, seeing if it pans out the way you expect. And I think that, as much as I like to think about cube as an exercise in game design, which I think is a valid way to look at it, it is a lot easier than doing game design from scratch. We have a resource system that we already know works. We have a lot of game pieces that we have some experience with. We kind of know how they interact. Plus, we don't, on the other end, have a publish date where we need to say, this game is going to print. It has to be, functional and work and be fully tested by that time. Playtesting a cube is very fluidly moving into just playing the cube. So, I mean, you don't necessarily need to set aside this formal playtesting session where you're doing things very differently and thinking about it differently. It really does just come down to you're playing the cube for the first time, potentially, and see if it pans out the way you expect and plan to iterate and evolve the cube based on that play experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally the best way to test for the experience of drafting with a full group of people is just to do it, right?
Yeah.
And there you go. Then that is an example of the kind of experience you're trying to capture. I do think there's a difference in playing the cube to just play it and playing the cube to test it sometimes.
But do you ever fully turn off that designer brain when you're playing your own cube, or you're always kind of like,
I mean, as much as I can,
watching and looking for feedback? At least maybe if you do successfully do it.
Not even the feedback thing. I mean, like, sometimes I will sit down with the intention of like, I'm going to see if this deck is viable. Like I'm going to force this thing, or like I'm going to like go out of my way to try and do a thing that maybe I don't think is the best thing to do, but I want to see what happens if I try and do it. Or there's even some small ways you can change the experience of playing with a focus on testing. Something we've done in the past, which I really like, is when testing new cards from a new set, just keep your cube as is, don't add any of them, draft normally, then at the end say everybody can have a copy of any of the cards I plan on including from the new set. So everybody gets them. There's multiple of them that are being played in the draft. They're proxied, obviously, in most cases. And they just get to add them to their pool, right? That's changing the game. That's changing the playing of Magic and the draft and the game experience with a sort of focus on what we're doing here is playing Magic, which is fun. And this is not going to be any less fun for this experiment we're doing, but we're also having a little bit of an eye towards determining the viability, determining how these cards fit into this environment.
Sure. So fundamentally, playtesting just means playing it out and seeing how it works, and having your players make a good faith effort to win and not just sort of goof off, whatever. But what you're sort of hinting at is there are ways you can sort of get this hyper concentrated play experience, because if you're getting an 8-person draft even once a week, it's going to take a long time before you necessarily have a really meaningful set of quantitative or even just qualitative information to sort of answer the questions you might have about an environment. But you can kind of accelerate that by doing things like you're suggesting, by saying, hey, these are particular cards you want to test in this environment. Let's just make sure those see play by giving everybody access to them. And I think there's a lot of strategies to sort of concentrate and accelerate that experience if you are really looking to do a more focused play test.
I actually want to broaden our scope of testing to not just play testing. I mean, I think people would obviously know that the best way to test your cube is just to play it. But I get the sense from at least Boy Sage on the Discord and probably a lot of listeners that there's a question of, if I have a lot more time to dedicate to my cube than my playgroup does, and I want to spend time working on it and refining it, how do I have some kind of feedback loop where I make a decision and then I see what the impact of that decision is to then affect future decisions? And I think there are ways to build some kind of feedback loop that don't necessarily include playing with a full pod. And I think that's the real thrust of this question, is how can I do that test in isolation or relative isolation without having to have a full pod around me?
Yeah, absolutely. And that could be super valuable, because I think a lot of people are, like you say, willing to spend a ton of time designing and working on their own cube. I certainly am. But getting that real play experience is a much more limited resource.
Yeah. So I think working backwards from, obviously, full pod with your full play group, we've talked about some of the things you can do, like just giving them access to cards you want to test. If your cube is bigger than 360 or bigger than whatever number of cards is required to actually draft it, you could seed the packs to make sure that all the cards you want to test actually show up in the packs, as opposed to being left over in the box if you have a bigger cube than you need. Those things, I think, are good ways to maybe focus your playing session with an eye towards learning and learning about whether these cards are viable.
And when you're doing sort of this like normal play experience of you just have a full 8-person pod, or maybe your cube is designed to be drafted with 4 or a different number, whatever sort of your ultimate goal for the experience is for, you can definitely do a lot to sort of pay attention and tune your experience to get some meaningful information. So that can be, obviously, just as a first level, just looking at the decks that win and perform well. Are those the kinds of decks that you're interested in and want to see perform? You can also just get a lot of qualitative information by doing a little debrief after the draft and talking to your players. What was fun? What wasn't fun? What cards overperformed or underperformed? Or are there cards that, just ended up in sideboards that players just weren't interested in or didn't like playing against that were in the main deck? So definitely having some sort of debrief, I think it's also just a lot of fun to me as a cube designer, can give you a lot of information. And critically, I think that the qualitative information can be as informative as the quantitative. So sure, it'd be great to say we did 100 drafts of this and saw that this green-white deck always wins, it always 3-0s, and it kind of takes away some of the agency from players because they're really just trying to get into that one deck. But we don't have access to that data, but that's okay. Still, just having people say, like, I really enjoyed drafting this deck is still a meaningful qualitative piece of data.
I mean, I always think of this tweet from Andrew Ellenbogen, which is, quote, "Competitive Magic is the art of correctly generalizing from sample sizes too small to draw real conclusions," which I think that really informs how I approach testing too. I don't think about quantitative analysis at all with any of my cube designs for a lot of reasons. Even if I was able to do 100 drafts, there's a lot of evidence to say that's not even close to statistical relevance when you try and disentangle all of the different variables that are happening when you play a cube. I mean, even just the better player prefers a particular color combination.
Yeah, I feel like that's a huge factor that informs a lot of the data that, or sort of the experience that I get out of my environments.
Yeah, if you have a particularly good player in your environment and they prefer a particular color combination, over time it's going to seem like that's a powerful color combination. They're going to draft it more than average, and they're going to be more successful on average because they're going to make fewer mistakes in gameplay and fewer mistakes in drafting and deck building, and it's going to seem like that's just overpowered. So it's all of these variables that are basically impossible. I basically don't think about it at all, right? Quantitative thing is not on the table for me in terms of cube analysis.
Yeah,
but
you can even go check out the very first article on Lucky Paper by Jet about this topic exactly, about how we can't really get statistically significant information from the amount of play experience that we're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, in that article, I think Jed shows that on the order of tens of thousands of drafts, you start to get maybe a tiny scrap of actual relevant data, and obviously none of us are getting to that point with our cubes. So that's off the table completely, but something I think is really valuable is that Magic players are smart. Like, Magic players are, generally speaking, like, they're interested in trying to win a game. They're interested in trying to find the optimal strategy. And everyone's doing this Andrew Ellamogan trick, right? They're trying to look at what's going on in the game state, what's going on in the packs, what's going on in all of the sort of playing of the cube, and try and extrapolate and figure out, like, what is the actual best strategy. And you get to tap into everybody's unique perspective on that by, like you said, talking to them about, like, how their draft went. Someone just describing, hey, I didn't feel like I could beat this card. Maybe they even did. Maybe it was like their opponent mulled to 3 and they like played the card and actually they did beat it because it was a mull to 3. You look at that in a quantitative sense and it's like, well, the card lost. But that player could say, hey, I feel like I couldn't beat this card for these reasons, right? And
I'm definitely guilty of those experiences where it's like, oh god, you played that card, I'm so bummed out, I can't win, and then my opponent's like, dude, I'm at 4 and you have a flyer. Like, what are you complaining about?
Right. But that feeling that I didn't feel like I could beat that card, right? That little phrase says so much about so many, like, sprawling quantitative details of the cube, right? That person's thinking about all the cards they saw in the draft that they had an opportunity to take, all the cards that are in their pool they could main deck or not main deck, all the things that are in their deck that they could draw to possibly answer. Would that actually work? The sequences of games, how they could potentially play out and how they could possibly win. That little phrase is giving you a lot of insight into what could theoretically be measured by some supercomputer that simulated hundreds of thousands of drafts. But you don't have to do that because you have a player that's actually giving you this feedback. And are they always right? No, they're not always right. But ultimately, we've said on the show before that you're not really aiming for a perfectly balanced cube for supercomputers because you're not playing with supercomputers.
Right.
You're playing with people. If people regularly feel like they can't beat that card, does it matter if they can? No, they feel like they can't, and that's probably not a very fun game experience.
Right. They're absolutely correct in the sense that what is correct is what your player experiences, right? That's actually the information that is meaningful and valid.
Yeah. I think we could honestly do a whole episode on just, if you do a full draft, how do you extract meaningful cube design information from that draft? And we may have even done a topic like that in the past, but I want to kind of move on to other ways you can actually test a cube because, again, I think the real core of this question is, how do I, as a cube designer, build that feedback loop with myself so that I can make a design decision and test its viability, test whether that decision is achieving the goal that I've set forth for myself, and then continue to make those revisions. Kind of working backwards from the ideal, which is if you could make 2 changes to your cube and draft with your whole play group and play a bunch of matches and then talk about it, and then 3 hours later make 2 more changes and do it again. Obviously, that's not viable. I think the next thing is just drafting with a smaller group of people. And obviously, we've talked about drafting with 4 and with 6 people and ways you can do that. For our purposes of testing, I think it's much more likely that a lot of people will have one other person they can get to be almost as invested in the cube with them or be willing to play as much as they want. And I think one-on-one drafts are a great way to test the viability of a card in an environment.
I mean, they're also just fun, and
for sure,
even if it's not one other person that's invested as you, it's often easier to find a person to play with. So, yeah, I just enjoy a grid draft, personally.
Yeah, so like grid drafts, Houseman drafts, Winchester, Winston drafts, Glimpse drafts. There's all kinds of 2-player draft formats. We will link to all of the 2-player draft formats on our website, which describe all of these methods. It's worth noting that these decks are not going to be exactly the same as drafts in a full pod. For my cube, I think that Houseman drafts probably come closest to approximating what a draft of my cube in a full group looks like. And so if I care about specifically testing for the viability of a particular deck or card, I might prefer Houseman drafting over grid drafting or something, just because I feel like the decks are a little more powerful and closer in terms of what you would get in a full pod. Even absent all of that, right? Like, even if your deck doesn't look quite the same, you still get a good sense in that same qualitative way of like, oh, that card feels like once it hits the battlefield in this environment, the other cards in my deck and the cards I could have drafted just feel irrelevant. Or, that card feels completely outclassed by everything in my deck. So it's unlikely that even if you were to draft a different kind of deck, that card's performance is going to change so radically that it's going to be totally unviable in 2-player drafts and totally viable in 8-player drafts, A
lot of this exercise is just by analogy figuring out how do you take some smaller piece of information and apply it to your ultimate situation that you're trying to optimize for. Right. So if you're trying to optimize for, I want this cube to play a certain way with an 8-player draft, maybe you do a grid draft and you think, okay, I really enjoyed my deck here. It didn't perform quite as well or didn't quite look like a deck I wanted to play, but I know that I can count on getting like 3 or 4 more of like particular synergistic pieces just because of the mechanics of the draft in an 8-player draft. So I'll sort of adjust for that and think this worked well, and maybe the changes that I made panned out in a certain way. How do I take my knowledge of how a grid draft deck looks different from an actual 8-player cube pod draft and see if that scales in the way you expect?
Right, you can learn that a card functions, it does the thing it's supposed to do, and then know that, well, in the deck that I know can be drafted in a full pod, this card will obviously perform better, and that means that it's like worth inclusion here.
And that's where I think that as a player you might want to consider, like, am I doing a dedicated playtesting session? Like, am I trying to answer some questions by playing this game? Or am I just being a player and trying to win? Like, do I just want to ignore the aggro cards in my grid draft because I know I'm not likely to win? Or do I want to actually just force it and try and get a little bit of information?
You did beat me in 4 games with your aggro deck in the last grid draft we did.
It's context matters. In that particular environment, I think that those kinds of decks work pretty well in a grid draft.
Turns out. So yeah, if you can get one other person to draft with you, any of these 2-player draft formats, I think, are great for testing. Almost as good as testing with a full pod.
And they're quick. There's a bunch of them, so I would say just give them all a try and see which ones you enjoy the most.
Yeah, honestly, I think if you are making 2-player drafting a big part of your testing feedback loop, then I think specifically like shaking up the different formats regularly is a good idea, because none of them are exactly the same in terms of their approximation of a real 8-person draft, and the ways in which they differ vary from draft format to draft format. So if you only grid draft and use that to inform a lot of your design decisions, over time, your cube will hew towards being designed for grid drafting. And if you plan on grid drafting it a lot, and that's how you want the cube to be played, that's your goal, and that's perfect. But if you are trying to use grid draft as a proxy for an 8-player draft, maybe you should mix it up with some glimpse drafts, some various burn drafts, some Winchester drafts or Houseman drafts or whatever, just because each of those will give you kind of a slightly different perspective onto what your cube is doing.
Yeah, for sure.
One step below that, you can just draft with yourself. Now, I've never actually done this, but I know a lot of people in the cube design world that will 2-player draft where they draft both seats. They will set up an 8-player draft and draft their own cube entirely with them drafting every single seat. I know people that do this in paper. They will sit down and actually make all of the packs of their cube. They will walk around the table and just make picks and pass and go around and build 8 whole decks for themselves.
That seems like a whole day experience, and if you're willing to do that, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot you learn. Just I don't know what you learn exactly, but there's going to be a lot of information in just the amount of time you're spending looking at packs and thinking about cards and trying to reframe each pick that you're making.
I do think there is a important distinction between testing with anybody else and just testing with yourself. And it's not that one is more useful than the other, but if you are drafting entirely with yourself, what you're really testing is like, are the themes that I'm trying to capture, are the archetypes, like, are they here, right? Are my design goals being realized? What you're not testing are like, are those things balanced with each other, right? Because you as the designer have a certain perspective. You know these cards are here for these reasons. So what you can test are like, do I see enough cards for the Madness deck as I envision to come together, right? Or do I just not, because there's not enough Madness cards in the packs, or the Madness cards are generically good enough that other players are taking them? Like, that's the kind of question you can answer. I don't think with only your own brain you can answer like, well, what is the best card in this pack? Mm-hmm. And what is the best deck at this table? Because you are inherently very biased for having created the entire environment. And obviously, if you're purely trying to spike a draft, then drafting against yourself doesn't really work because you know what everybody else is doing, and that's not how drafts work in real life. So there's a little bit of like suspension of disbelief and just like, kind of pretending that you don't know what's going on. Really what you're doing in that situation, I think, is just do the decks that I want to exist in this environment actually come together, but not answering the question of like, does this deck is this deck reasonable to play, or is it way underpowered or way overpowered?
Right, or questions just about is the payoff for this particular theme appealing enough that my players are actually going to take it and draft it and use particular cards as an entry point into particular decks, because you're going to be biased. You're going to potentially just take the card because you think that theme is cool.
I mean, or not, or like you could be halfway through pack 2 in some cool synergistic red deck, and then just be like, well, in this pack I can either take a lightning bolt or this synergy piece, and I know that I'm going to take a lightning bolt here if I'm actually playing in real pod, and like that's a relevant experience for you to have. And I think it's basically impossible to sit down and like project and imagine yourself in all these possible futures. So actually doing that and actually having a deck you drafted, having a pool, having a pack in front of you, and getting to make that isolated decision can tell you things like, hey, maybe, having this generically powerful removal spell here is actually not what I want, because it's going to not allow me to draft this synergy piece if I'm actually trying to spike the draft. And so that experience of drafting with yourself, I think, it inform a lot.
Totally. I mean, and like all this, you're sort of taking partial pieces of information and then trying to extrapolate and apply that to bigger questions. And I could definitely see using that method, you could answer questions like, well, like you said, do I have enough density of this particular effect that if I just force, one seed is just going to force the madness deck, are they going to get all the pieces they need? And the answer might be that, well, no, in the next pack, you just took a bunch of the madness cards off because you needed a removal spell. So it turned out that those pieces just didn't make it to the drafter that was drafting this more thematic thing that you want to see and see come together in a certain density, because some of the pieces were actually just too powerful and too flexible, so they ended up in other decks.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is if you are going to draft with yourself, I think moving the opposite direction of the packs is a much better way to do it, because then you're not following the decision you made previously, right? You're actually going backwards, which means that by the time you get back around, you probably won't really remember what you took 7 packs ago, and so you're like, well, I don't know what's going to get past to me. So I think that's actually probably a good way to handle that. I think that's really valuable and a very viable way to do testing. It is very time consuming, and so the question is like, do you want to invest all this time in doing that? Outside of paper drafts, and you could draft with yourself in paper or digitally, but there are other ways to digitally draft online, and I think these are great ways to also test your cube. I actually think that drafting and not even playing the games oftentimes gives you a lot of information as a cube designer, right? Like, I think a lot of times good players can sit down and, our experience streaming last week, maybe not included, can sit down and kind of agree, like, yeah, this deck seems a little better than that one. Or like, I think that this deck really came together and this one didn't. This draft was kind of a train wreck. And so just by drafting, you can see all these decks kind of come together, and whether your design goals are actually being realized in cards, it's a lot faster and it's a lot easier in terms of scheduling and stuff to get people to draft online with you. And so I have had situations in the past where I've gotten a group of people on the Discord together and we've said, hey, can we just draft this cube 5 times back to back, no games, we're just gonna speed draft this cube, and then I'm gonna take all those deck lists and use that as a way to inform design decisions or get feedback from people on that particular cube.
Yeah, I mean, you as a player probably have a tremendous amount of experience playing Magic, so even with just sort of this partial experience of what do the decks look like, you can answer a lot of questions about how the whole end-to-end experience plays out.
And you can know, I don't have any removal, so I'm going to lose to flyers, or you can know that I don't have a particular type of effect, and so I'm going to be weak against certain types of decks, and that is just... You don't have to play the games to realize that, right? You can say, looking at the deck list, yeah, I'm going to have problem removing anything with toughness greater than 3, and so I hope my opponents don't play a 4/4.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting thing that just touches on the way that cubes are designed differently, where I think that if you're designing a cube which is very much inspired by or trying to reflect the kind of gameplay as a particular format, like you're building a legacy cube and you want it to kind of feel like legacy, or modern cube, you want it to feel kind of like modern, then it's much easier to take that sort of experience of just what do the decks look like and apply that to the broader experience and say, yeah, this is probably working the way I want it to. If you're designing sort of a lower powered cube in sort of this novel space, some of those questions do get a lot harder to answer, where it's like, well, am I soft to flyers, or do I have enough big things that I can just win the clock in this particular matchup is harder to answer. So especially if you are designing in more novel space, that having some of that end-to-end experience is necessary. But even then, if you do a couple of 8-person drafts, you kind of get a sense for how things play out. Then you can take all that experience and apply it to these sort of more partial pieces of information.
So ways to draft online with people. Cube Cobra does have multiplayer drafting now. I'll be honest, I can't recommend it. Cube Cobra is pretty broken at the moment, and I wish it wasn't the case. I love you, Gwen, but the site is kind of a mess right now. So If you don't want to use Cube Cobra, there's also other tools. There's draforft.info,
Yeah, you're going to spell that one.
DR4FT, so draft, but a 4 instead of an A.info. That's a very simple site that will allow you to import your cube from Cube Cobra directly and run a draft with other people. You can send them a link and they basically join. A very similar site that's got a few more features and I think is a little more reliable based on what I've heard from people is mtgadraft.tk.
Yeah, importantly, this is called MTG Arena Deck, but it works with other environments as well. That's just where the site started.
Yeah. So you can use that for any type of cube. You just import a card list and just draft there. So these are all different ways you can do that. And Draforft and MTGA Draft will also both give you draft logs if you want. So not only can you get the final pools from people, but you can see exactly what they picked in every single seat. I have in the past looked over those and actually kind of I'll take the whole draft log and Command F for a card and see where was the card taken and how many packs was it passed in before it was taken and what was taken over it. Those kinds of questions you can answer with those logs, which is kind of cool. The other thing that's great about drafting online is, again, the scheduling's easy. You can get people to do it oftentimes on their lunch break or sometimes not on their lunch break, just when they're at work, if you have certain types of friends. You can also very easily have players draft multiple seats, a lot more easily than in paper. So on both these websites, you can open up a private browsing tab, or if you have multiple profiles in your browser, and just go to the same draft link and just get in multiple seats of that draft. And so if you have another person and you want to do an 8-player draft with just each of you drafting every alternate seat, that's much easier to do here than obviously the logistics in paper. And so you can also organize that with any amount of people that you have. You can kind of just run these things. There are also bots on both of these sites. So if you have 5 people and you want to run an 8-person draft with 3 bots, you can also do that. So there's a lot of flexibility here if you just want to churn out drafts and learn from the experience of drafting a cube. I think drafting it online is a great way to do it.
Yeah, and you can also sort of mix and match some of these approaches as well. If you have done an online draft and you then just want to take those decks, you have one other player that you can play with in paper, you can actually just take some of those decks and assemble them and actually get a pretty complete picture of what the whole experience looks like without having to get 8 people at a table all at the same time.
Yeah, which is a nice segue into the next way to test cubes, which is that there are services that will allow you to basically test and play Magic decks online with each other without having to go through all the Magic Online and Magic Arena stuff. So tools like Cockatrice, Xmage, I know some people do this on Untapped, the website untapped.in, I believe is what it is. Most of them have no rules enforcement. You're just kind of moving cards between zones, but it will allow you to digitally, if you have 2 lists, just kind of goldfish a game, see how it goes, play with somebody else, and then see what happens. Which, again, if you have somebody that's willing to do this with you, even if it's at a weird time or they're in a different time zone or they're not nearby, you can do that online, which is obviously almost as good as playing a real game. You can just actually test things out, and it's much faster than shuffling up, building decks from paper. You can just kind of run games, see how they feel.
But you don't get that tactile experience of shuffling
It's not
cards.
as fun.
You do lose that.
Definitely not as fun, at least for me. So that is definitely a downside of that. It feels more like work at that point when you're testing it, a little less like having fun and playing a game, to me at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a personal experience. I feel like a lot of players who play Magic just do focus on the gameplay and the decisions they're making. That's where they derive most of their joy. So playing online is potentially even better. But yeah, I'm with you. For me, it does come down to the social experience that is a key part of playing Magic for me.
Taking one step further down the sort of tier list of how close to a regular 8-person draft are we and how easy or difficult is it to do this kind of testing, you could just simulate solo drafts on Cube Cobra, right? Just click the playtest button, draft your cube, and, see how it plays out. Again, right now the bots are kind of totally broken on Cube Cobra. I think as best we can tell, they're just taking cards randomly. You can view the bot drafts at the end of a draft and see what every other bot drafted, and right now they're all just drafting 5-color nonsense with no real curve or synergy. So I don't think that the current bot drafts, or really any simulated bot drafts, are representative of an 8-player draft. So you have to approach that with a different perspective and a different goal than I'm going to sit down and draft the hard way and do a real draft and see what it actually feels like. I still think there's a lot that can be learned, though, by just simulating those drafts.
Yeah, I think some of the easiest questions you can answer this way are those questions about, is a particular theme or strategy supported enough? Do you have enough cards? And obviously you could also just do some math, do some hypergeometric calculations and see what things look like. But really doing the draft helps you because a lot of cards don't necessarily fit into clean, tidy buckets. So it's much easier just to do a couple drafts and sort of force things and see, okay, yeah, I do feel like there is enough density of these particular effect to make this kind of strategy meaningful.
That is exactly how I do drafts on Cube Cobra, basically. If I'm simulating a draft, I will either sit down and say, I'm just going to force the mono red deck 4 times. And, by forcing that deck 4 times in a row and not ever looking at a pack and trying to decide what the best pick is, just what's the best pick for my mono red deck. I think doing that 4 times, even against bots that are taking cards semi-randomly, you can still get a good sense of like, what does this deck look like when it comes together? What's the range of this deck? What are the cards I'm looking for I'm most excited to see? What are the cards that are kind of like begrudgingly playable? You learn a lot just from looking at cards in that new context in an actual pack that you can actually learn things about a deck. The other thing I'll do is I'll sit down and I'll look at the first pack on Cube Cobra and decide what I'm going to force based on that. So here's a cool build around. I guess I'll force that and see how that works.
So you mean how most people draft?
Yes, exactly. So how too many people will end up drafting. Yeah, I'll basically just like, the first card I see I'm interested in, that'll be what I'll then force for that draft. I, again, don't think, especially with how the bots are currently, it is particularly useful to sit down and try and draft as a human, in a drafting the hard way kind of sense. Because, for example, right now on this new cube I've been working on, you just get Demonic Tutor, pick 7 every single time. And it's like, okay, well, if I'm drafting the hard way, I always end up playing black because I always get Demonic Tutor, so I just end up drafting the same deck over and over again because the bots don't take these cards. That's not useful, I don't think. Like, what you're then doing is you're using your play testing or your play drafting as a means of determining where the holes in the bots are. And that's not useful to use a cube designer. Who cares what the bots are overlooking regularly? You just care about what your environment looks like.
It's funny how when I think earlier on in Arena, optimizing how to beat the bots was actually kind of a feature of Arena gameplay, but I think for most cube designers, that's definitely not what we're looking to optimize for.
Yeah, so I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Yeah, I mean, and bigger picture, I think just being aware of what are the limitations, what are the holes in any piece of data that you have about your environment, and figuring out how to appropriately analogize that to the broader experience, taking those limitations into account is really important.
If you want to draft with different bots too, there are other websites you can draft on. So Cube Artisan is a website that is basically a clone of Cube Cobra that some people have had better experience with the actual drafting experience on. The bots are... There's a whole thing going on right now with the bots in the Cube world, and everybody's kind of trying to use the same bots, but it's complicated. Cube Artisan...
Building software is hard. It's a big thing.
Cube Artisan, Draforft, and MTGA Draft, all the I've previously mentioned websites, all have bot drafts available on them. So if you want to try drafting your cube with different bots, or at least a different implementation of bots, you can import your list over there and run bot drafts there where you're drafting a single seat, and that might free you from a particular bias of one set of bots or one implementation of AI draft bots, if that is useful to you. Have we missed any? I think that kind of brings us to the end of ways that you can play or draft your cube with an eye towards testing. Is there anything else you can think of?
I think one other thing you can do that I've seen players do is don't actually draft at all. Just try and focus on the gameplay and just take your whole list and build decks that you can't imagine would be drafted and play those against each other. So if you have this idea of, I really want to support this red-white aggressive deck and also this green mid-range deck, let's just try and build those as best as we can from the pool, smash them against each other again, just with 1 or 2 other players if you got them. That's another way you can sort of calibrate the balance of different decks.
Yeah, I've never done this myself. I did ask on Twitter leading up to the recording of this episode what are ways that people test their cube, and a couple people said just building constructed decks, construct the deck the way I want it to come together in draft and see how it feels, or doing sealed, and then having a big pool available to you and then building a deck and playing it out. It seems like a lot of work to me, and I love drafting. Drafting is so fun, so even if I'm doing simulated drafts, I'll always prefer that over sitting down and constructing a deck list, but that's definitely a thing you can do if you're interested in it. Not really for me, I don't think, but it seems like you definitely could learn a lot that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's just testing a different sort of small segment of that experience, whether it's the draft experience or the gameplay experience.
Right.
So I think it's a question of where are you most concerned about the balance? What are you most interested in learning about? And I think maybe if you are just less experienced as a player, you don't necessarily have this backlog of play experience to rely on to say, oh yeah, I know how these decks are going to play out and compare to each other. So maybe that's someplace,
at least a little bit. Give some
maybe
sense.
that's someplace you want to put more of your focus and get more of your cube time information, the value you're going to get from it. So I could see that making a lot of sense.
I guess I lied a little bit. I have done something like this, and the context I've done it in is if there is a deck that all my players say is bad, is underperforming, but I think is good. I have in the past been like, I'm going to construct the deck that I think is successful in this archetype and then play it against decks that people drafted in a normal pod, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've had, back in my mono black aggro days, people were like, this deck's no good, it can't possibly win. And I'm like, well, look, if I just, here's a list. Here's a mono black draft list, either that I pulled together from a draft or I just constructed from the list of the cards in the cube. Let's play it against some other decks and see if it actually can't win, right? See if it's actually, that I think
what did you learn? Was it bad?
No, I mean, the deck was actually fine, but that's a whole different conversation because people just didn't want to draft it. And so it doesn't matter how viable it is. Again, it's just people just didn't want to take black 2/1s that could recur themselves. But that's a great example, I think, of how to apply different testing methodologies. So this testing methodology of like building a constructed deck from your entire cube list, that deck is obviously going to differ a lot in terms of power level from what could actually be drafted, because you've taken out all the variants of like, are the cards going to be in the packs in the right order, or am I going to wheel the cards I want? You're just saying the draft went perfectly, right? I got the archetypal like version of this deck, the perfect version of this deck. If you then play that against decks that were drafted with all that variants in a real pod and you still can't win, that's a pretty good way of like testing the worst or like an underpowered cube in your environment and figuring out where those big holes are. I wouldn't do that with an archetype that I thought was very successful, because it's like, yeah, I expect if you get to draft the perfect mono red aggro deck that you're just going to win, right? That's kind of how I expect my cube environment to work. And so I don't see any real value to testing that, but in specifically the context of like, is this not good enough? Is this deck actually a trap? That I think is a good way to actually test and answer that question.
Right, and in all of that, I think part of what you're saying is that if you're trying to get the most value out of some amount of time you're putting into testing a cube, and you have some expectation of what you're trying to do, focus on the places where you're less certain, where you have more questions.
The questions you want to answer most, Below actually drafting or playing your cube, Anthony,
just looking at it and
there is
thinking
a close,
really hard.
Just thinking really hard about your cube. Thinking really hard about your cube is I mean, that's what cube design is, right? And this is, I think, important for any design practice, right? Is again having this feedback loop of like, I make a change and then I evaluate it. And if you think about like a visual artist, that could be as simple as like, I made a mark on the canvas and I took 2 steps back and I looked at it from a different angle, and then I determined whether or not that was the mark I wanted to make, right? These little tiny feedback loops, I think, are valid and useful ways to actually design a cube. If you're making design decisions, Anthony, and you're not going to do any test drafts, there's nobody around to like help you, what are the things you think about most when you're adding or removing cards from one of your cubes?
That's a really difficult question. And I mean, I think that the thing that I'm always looking for most is just what's exciting, what's fun, what are the cards that I think are going to draw people in. And then next level to that is sort of how does a particular card play in that environment? So if I'm thinking, well, this card seems a little bit overpowered, let's actually just filter the list and figure out how many removal spells are there that can destroy this creature, or what other kinds of decks, what kind of deck do I think this card is going to fit in, and is that particular deck actually currently a little bit overtuned or undertuned, and how is that going to impact the environment? But it is really difficult, I think, especially because a lot of the cubes that I have been designing are a little bit off the beaten path in terms of I don't necessarily know what the gameplay is going to look like, because they're not necessarily modeled off constructed formats or cubes that are on Magic Online that there's lots of player experience. So in those contexts, it is really hard without having a little bit of play experience. So, I mean, this isn't exactly the answer to your question, but I think that critically mixing up a lot of all of these different aspects of looking at a cube is really valuable, because just having one 8-player pod draft under your belt makes that experience of doing some just total theory crafting so much easier.
Yeah, I think there are great examples of ways you can like put in a little extra legwork to learn a thing about your environment that you otherwise wouldn't have a chance to know. And we've done this on the show a lot, partially because we need to make a podcast, and it's like, well, here's a topic we can pursue.
We don't need to make a podcast.
I mean,
stop.
I do want to make a podcast.
Okay,
I wanted to make a podcast. So I would refer people to like the texture of removal episodes we did. We did a couple episodes about the different kinds of removal. In those episodes, I spent 30 minutes on each of our cubes and went through all of the different kinds of removal spells and categorized them subjectively and somewhat, qualitatively. Like these are not like rigid buckets that you can actually like search for with a filter on Scryfall. This is like me putting things into soft versus hard removal spells and deciding that, hey, actually, you know what? I'm going to call Flame Slash a hard removal spell because there's like 2 things in my cube that have more than 4 toughness. And so that's effectively, in practice, a hard removal spell. Going through and doing that work always surprises me. I always learn something. As much as I think about my cubes, I go through and like do those kind of categorizations, and I'm always like, I have way more of this thing than I thought I had, or not as much of this thing as I thought I had. And so doing those kinds of, I don't even know what to call it. I mean, it's like, it's not an experiment. You're just like, you're going through and spending time.
Just like focused observation.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. Yeah. Focused thinking about a particular aspect of your cube. Using the tagger feature to actually tag things, I think is very helpful if you want to, then you actually can filter by it in the future if you're going to go through and do all this work in the first place. It does teach me things about my cubes whenever I do that, every single time without fail.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way not just to answer questions, but to figure out what questions you should be asking. Just looking through the list carefully, thinking about starting with one question, like how many removal spells do I have, is going to lead to additional questions like, well, what is the actual breakdown of the toughness of creatures? So how do I want to categorize these things? So yeah, I think that letting yourself fall into a rabbit hole of asking and discovering new questions is super valuable.
I think at some point we should maybe like try and catalog different kinds of questions you could ask and answer this way, right? Like questions about your cube. Like I think the removal texture is a great example. And I had a lot of people write us and say, I never thought about it this way. And when I looked at my list, it turns out I had tons of hard removal spells and I actually prefer soft removal spells. Or I had tons of hard removal at certain mana cost and I wanted that mana cost to be different or something. So there are a lot of quantitative tools on Cube Cobra, a lot of graphs of mana value, of type, a lot of analytics essentially about pick orders and ELOs, and a lot of those things, again, are kind of broken right now. But if you do want to do any kind of type of quantitative analysis about your cube, that is an avenue by which you can definitely do it. And I would just offer the caveat here that I have never found any purely quantitative analysis of cube from a design perspective to be particularly helpful to me personally. There's a whole group of cube designers that are really big on like the hypergeometric calculations, right? And they're like, well, I know for aggro to be viable, you need to have 7 1-drops in your deck because I need you to have at least an 80% chance of playing a 1-drop on turn 1. And then they work backwards from there and say, okay, well, if I need 7 1-drops in my deck, how many do I need in my draft pool in order to be able to get them based on all these hypergeometric calculations? And my issue with all that stuff is that it's all based on that founded assumption, right? Like, you base all of that on the core assumption of I need 7 1-drops in my deck. And that's subjective. That's entirely purely made up. So I think it's a good way to, if that's a goal of yours, I want people to be able to draft decks with 7 1-drops. Whether that's good or not, whether that makes aggro viable or not, if that's a goal of yours, then you can, in fact, work backwards from there and use some kind of quantitative analysis to figure out if that's possible. But you are going to miss a lot of things, right? I still think a better way to do that is just to sit down and force some simulated drafts or draft a bunch of times with some friends and figure out if the cards are actually in the packs, because doing it purely based on math doesn't account for whether this card is a very high pick or very generic or effectively a 1-drop, even though it's not a 1-drop on paper or, whatever. Those things don't show up when you're just running the math like that.
I'm a lot higher than you on these tools. I do think it just, like, this focused thinking or any of these different experiences, I think it does just force you to look at the environment differently, and getting a different perspective is always valuable. But I do think there is that really, really, really critical piece that, well, two aspects. One is that the ultimate goal is probably not to be able to put a certain number of 1-drops and a certain number of 2-drops. The ultimate goal is to make an environment that's fun. And these are all just little aspects that are in service of meeting that actual goal. But I think really critically, when you're looking at this quantitative data, you need to tie that into some experience and some sort of qualitative measure of what makes this experience fun. So if you're looking at this, you don't want to just say like, oh, I have this many removal spells. Is that good or bad? Well, that's not really an answer at all. It's just one little piece of data. So you need to then tie that into, okay, I've played this environment and it had this number of removal spells. I played this environment that had a totally different number of removal spells. Here's how those were different, and I'm going to now be able to ask a meaningful question about how many removal spells I want based on knowing how those numbers correlate to the kind of texture of games and the kind of experience of gameplay and whether or not it was fun for you.
That's a very valuable thing to learn if you have the opportunity, is like if you can calibrate your sense of playing lots of different cubes in their entirety, drafting in games and like seeing what it feels like, and then being able to say, this environment felt X way. It felt like boards were really big and it was really important to have some way to break through stalls. It felt like having a 1-drop was really important. It felt like, hard removal was a really high value kind of effect. Being able to then transfer those feelings, and again, those like qualitative subjective feelings, I think point to really sprawling, hard to define, big quantitative truths, right? The feeling you had comes from somewhere, and the place it comes from would be very hard to measure like concretely with math because of all the various variables involved in a Magic draft and a game. But being able to then tie that feeling to some describable attribute of the environment, I think, is really valuable to learn that, like, if I play a cube with a higher power level band, this is what it ends up feeling like. Or if I play a cube with a ton of removal, this is what it ends up feeling like. Or a cube with a really high curve or a really low curve, this is how it ends up feeling. Those are the kinds of things that you can start to then have a much better barometer for your own cube design decisions about whether or not you're achieving what you want to achieve because you've felt different types of cubes. So it's actually kind of a dumb thing to say, but you should play lots of different kinds of cubes as a cube designer. That's a hugely valuable tool to you to realize what's possible and to calibrate your own senses for what different card choices do to an environment.
Yeah, I mean, just to give a really specific example, I was looking recently at my own main cube and noticing that the black section was really light on 2-drops and the red section is really high on 2-drops. So if I was just taking this totally let's use this data, treat making the data looking beautiful and symmetrical as the goal, I would probably say, yeah, I need to add a bunch more black 2-drops and cut a bunch of red ones. But when I actually compare that to the gameplay experience, I'm actually going to treat those two pieces of data very differently and say that, yeah, the mono red decks, they do have too many red 2-drops because my experience is it feels really crowded when I'm building my deck on that space, and then in gameplay, sometimes those decks are trying to curve out and it's hard to use all my mana and make a red deck that plays the way I want it to function in that way. It feels a little clumsy in that early sequencing, whereas the black decks are often a little more focused on getting to that late game, and there are more opportunities to, use one extra mana to cycle or do something else on turn
Activate
2.
some ability.
Absolutely. So it just doesn't, that doesn't pan out into a negative play experience. And I think that's just an example of taking that data and not just treating it as make it beautiful and symmetrical, but apply it to the story that you're trying to tell and the experience you're trying to create.
Yeah, I guess that's really important to mention while we're talking about the testing of just thinking really hard about your cube. It's really easy to fall into some traps there. And, if you're looking at your cube list a lot, just the way that it happens to be presented on Cube Cobra or whatever can have a big influence on what you think makes sense, right? And this is where that, I think, preference for perfectly balanced color sections and perfectly balanced gold card sections and curves that are equal across the field, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. You're looking at your cube from a remove in a, big spreadsheet, basically, and you want all the things to line up, where players are never going to actually feel a lot of those tiny distinctions ever in actual gameplay. And so you're designing for a thing that is never going to be felt by the actual thing you care about, which is when you're drafting and playing those games. So I guess I would say don't get too in the weeds about thinking about your cube in the abstract. And as much as you can learn from just thinking really hard about Magic cards, you should also have that anchored in real play experience as much as possible.
I would caveat that a little bit by just saying it kind of depends on what you're looking for. I think that we as cube designers are very focused on the gameplay in almost all cases. That is the goal, is we want to create a certain kind of gameplay and we want it to be fun. It's also totally valid if your cube experience is, I just want to make this sort of a museum of Magic, or I want to make this a museum of a particular flavor that I love about Magic, or I just love tinkering with my spreadsheets and making it beautiful and symmetrical and having that choice of what are my 2 is-it spells that I'm going to elect to have. If that's fun for you, that's also great and valid.
Yeah, I think if you're that person, then
you're not listening to this episode.
You turned this off a long time ago because this is not what you're looking for.
Or maybe you just like hanging out with us, and I appreciate that too.
Thanks for hanging out. You're cool. What else, Anthony? Have we missed any ways to test your cube, to build this design experience feedback loop that can inform your cube design decisions?
I think we covered it pretty well. I just want to change my cube a bunch now and then go play it a bunch.
So we gave a pretty comprehensive list. The things I actually do, it's worth noting. I mean, I play my cube as much as possible, and I'm very lucky to have a big local play group. We play every single week, sometimes more. So that's the main thing I do. And then I do a lot of the qualitative thinking very hard in a focused way about the cube, like doing the texture of removal exercises, doing the texture of threats exercise, which is the thing that maybe we'll come to in a future episode I've been tinkering with. And then I also just simulate drafts to force decks, and those are the kind of things I do the most. During the pandemic, when we couldn't get together, I did a lot more of these other things of drafting a cube a bunch of times online with people, just back-to-back, doing 5 drafts of a cube and seeing how it panned out, or playing games on Cockatrice or whatever. I did those things more when that was the only thing I could do. Now that I can play more Magic, I mostly play Magic and then think about my cube when I can on my own time.
Play Magic and think about Magic, our 2 favorite hobbies.
What do you actually do out of all these things? I don't think you do all these things. What are the things you do for your personal cube testing workflow?
I'm pretty similar. It also depends sort of where I am with a cube design. When I'm starting early on, I'll do a lot more simulated drafts on Cube Cobra, because that is going to answer a lot of questions that are relevant. Just are the broad strokes of the density of different things present here in the way that I expect. So at that early stage of design, I think that's super useful. And then ideally moving beyond that, it's a lot of 2-player grid drafts, things like that, and I just really value, again, having that context of at least a little bit of actual drafts in the mode that I am optimizing mostly for, which is a full 8-player person pod.
Well, hopefully something in this episode has given you another idea for how you can playtest your own cube and, again, form that feedback loop so you can know whether your design decisions are having their intended effect, and if not, revise them moving forward. Real quick, I want to thank some people that recently left some reviews for us on iTunes. Big thank you to Jason Belk, Nick Lapointe, and D Nolan 8 parentheses Dave. Thanks to all of you for dropping a 5-star review on iTunes. It really does help. So we don't ask for it often, but if you don't mind popping over to iTunes, tapping that 5 stars, and writing a little 1-sentence positive review, that is a great way for us to get the show out there. And honestly, the biggest reason I like it is because if we're trying to like angle for some big famous guest, having a lot of reviews over there kind of lends some legitimacy to this podcast and makes it seem like we're not just two dudes sitting in a basement thinking really hard about Magic cards. So thanks to all of y'all for doing that. And I believe that concludes another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, designing entirely too many cubes and trying to figure out how to playtest them, and then sitting down and speaking into microphones about it. May you test well, Anthony.
Too many cubes, you think?
We have a lot of cubes. I have a lot of abandoned, half-baked, quarter idea cubes that I started and then just was like, can't finish this. Sometimes people listening to the back episodes of the podcast will email me or message me and be like, oh, you mentioned this idea on a podcast, whatever came of that? And I'm like, nothing. Sorry.
That was the last I thought about.
Sorry, here's a list of 120 cards on Cube Cobra that was like the first pass of things I could think about. Feel free to actually take this idea and actually do it, because I didn't.
Maybe we should have like a cube hackathon, but it's just like, let's fully bake all these half-baked ideas. Call it the Cube Bake Off.
I definitely go through like seasons where I need to be like really excited about a project to like want to do that. It feels like if it's a cube idea that maybe I had a while ago that's just like kind of lingering, it feels like work to go in and actually refine that. Whereas if I'm really excited about an idea, I get that like fun thrill of working on a new cube and like discovering the new stuff for the first time, which is I'm there right now on this neoclassical cube I've been working on, which we'll talk about in the show at some point, but it's been really fun to have the like aha moment of like, of course, that card. Took me like 3 weeks to remember that card was a thing, but that's perfect for this environment. Those kinds of realizations are so fun.
As I'm getting older, I'm appreciating more and more with creative projects that there's this really important limited resource of just like enthusiasm and ability to focus on a thing. Like I've got to fix some things with the cube map so I can get that updated, and it's only going to take me half an hour probably, but it's not the
really
time
hard.
That's limited.
It's really hard to get that.
It's that focus resource, because I want to work on this other thing instead if I have half an hour.
Yeah. Too many cool things to work on. Good problem to have.